You see the longships in movies, dragon prows, bearded warriors, raids for gold and glory. But nobody talks about the other cargo they brought back. The children, thousands of them, ripped from monasteries, villages, coastal towns across Europe. The Annals of Ulster, 821. A great booty of women taken near Dublin. 1 century later, 3,000 people seized in a single raid. Children, mothers, monks, herded onto ships. The movies show the battle. They don't show what happened next. They don't show the markets. Dublin, Hedeby, Burka, where children stood on blocks next to livestock, where human life was weighed in silver, where speaking the wrong language, or the right one, determined if you lived as a thing or a person. 841. Vikings established Dublin on the River Liffey, not just a settlement, a machine. Archaeological evidence from Wood Quay and Temple Bar reveals the infrastructure. Iron shackles found near harbors, small post and wattle structures, 3 meters by 2.5 meters, with hearths and human fleas, not homes. Holding pens, where captives waited like cattle for market day. Neil Price, Uppsala University archaeologist, published his findings in Children of Ash and Elm in 2020. He states it clearly. This was a slave economy. Slavery wasn't a side business for Vikings. It was the business. Research published in Slavery and Abolition Journal, April 2019, documents the scale. Up to 10% of Scandinavia's population were thralls, the Old Norse word for slave. Tens of thousands of people, most of them captured young. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Journal of Archaeological Sciences 2013 and 2014 isotope analysis studies led by Elise Naumann at the University of Oslo, cross-referenced with Ben Raffield's 2019 Comprehensive Archaeological Survey from Uppsala University's Viking Phenomenon Project, backed by the Smithsonian's authoritative 2020 Historical Review in their August 19th article titled The Little-Known Role of Slavery in Viking Society, by distinguished Professor Neil Price. We're not guessing. We're giving you what the dirt and bones actually say. Now back to the information. The children came from everywhere. Ireland's coast, Britain's monasteries, Eastern European villages, Slavic territories so targeted that Slavonk itself comes from Slav. 793. The raid on Lindisfarne Monastery starts it, but that's just the first recorded hit. For the next 3 centuries, ships leave full and return fuller. DNA studies published in various genetics journals show the pattern. Iceland's founding population, 80% of men have Scandinavian genes, but 67% of women show Celtic Irish or Scottish ancestry. They didn't emigrate voluntarily. They were cargo, young women captured in raids, taken north, forced into Norse households, their children born into bondage, archaeological excavations at Flakstad in Norway's Lofoten Islands. Documented in the Journal of Archaeological Science 2014, Arax examined 10 individuals from Viking age burials. 3 were decapitated. Isotope analysis showed they ate differently than the bodies buried with heads intact. Fish-heavy diets, the food of slaves. The others ate meat and dairy, the food of masters. The headless bodies weren't related to their grave companions. Ancient DNA proved it. They were thralls, killed, buried as grave goods. Property following owners into death. Children had it worse. Not because Vikings were specifically cruel to children, because children were the perfect product, easier to control than adults, more years of labor ahead, malleable. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat and lawyer from Baghdad, traveled the Volga River trade routes in 922. His account, translated and published in Mission to the Volga by James Montgomery in 2014, describes what he saw. Rus Vikings, the Scandinavian traders operating in Eastern Europe, kept slave girls in their trading posts. Each morning, he wrote, a slave girl would bring a basin of water. The master would wash, blow his nose, spit in it, then pass it to the next man. The same water, the same basin. 40 men, 1 bowl, the slave girl carrying humiliation from man to man. This was daily life. Routine degradation. Ibn Fadlan documents worse. When a wealthy Rus died, the family asked the slaves a question, which of you will die with him? Usually a girl volunteered, or claimed to volunteer. We'll never know if the choice was real. For days before the funeral, she was dressed, given alcohol, made to sing. Then came the ceremony. She was taken to the funeral ship, raped repeatedly by the dead man's companions. Tell him we do this out of love, they said to her. Then an old woman, Ibn Fadlan, calls the angel of death strangled her with a cord while 2 men stabbed her. The crowd banged shields to drown her screams. The ship was set on fire. Her body burned with her masters. This account, written firsthand in 922, matches archaeological evidence from burial sites across Scandinavia. The graves at Flakstad, the double and triple burials at multiple Norwegian sites, the decapitated bodies, the young women with crushed skulls found on the Isle of Man, mixed with animal ash. But here's what the movies miss. The ones who died quickly were the lucky ones. The others faced something worse than death: erasure. Children captured young enough forgot their birth language within months. Rigsthula, one of the Eddic poems from Old Norse literature preserved in medieval manuscripts but describing earlier beliefs, tells how thralls came to exist. The god Heimdall, using the name Rig, visits 3 households. At the poorest, he sleeps 3 nights between a couple named Ai and Edda. 9 months later, a son is born. Thrall, dark-skinned, crooked-backed, ugly, the poem says. Thrall grows up gathering firewood, feeding animals. He marries Thyr. She's described as filthy, sunburnt, with a hooked nose. Their children have names that translate to noisy, fatty, stinker, sluggard, stumpy. This wasn't history. This was programming, teaching Norse children that thralls were born inferior, born to serve, teaching thrall children the same lesson: you are stumpy, you are stinker, your children will be too. The reality was darker. Children born to thrall mothers became thralls automatically. The law was clear. A freeborn father could acknowledge a child born to his thrall, then the child gained freedom. But if he refused, the child inherited the mother's chains forever. Stephen Brink's Thraldom, A History of Slavery in the Viking Age, published by Oxford University Press in September 2021, documents this cycle. Hereditary thralls were called foster, meaning fosterling. Born into slavery, raised into slavery, dying in slavery, their children repeating the pattern. The only escape was manumission, freedom granted by the master. It happened. Rune stones prove it. At Herning in Jutland, Denmark. A stone reads, Toki Smith raised the stone in memory of Thorgisel Gudmunder's son, who gave him gold and freedom. Toki was a craftsman, skilled, valuable. He earned or was given his freedom, but even then, the law wasn't done with him. Freed thralls became Leisingi, freedmen, still not fully free. They owed allegiance to their former masters, lower rights to legal compensation. Their children might gain full rights, their grandchildren, maybe. 3 generations to wash away the stain of bondage. Language was the weapon, the tool of control. Children captured from Ireland, Britain, Eastern Europe, arrived speaking Celtic languages, Anglo-Saxon, Slavic tongues. Within months in a Norse household, those languages faded. Dr. Sarah Ponsans at the University of Nottingham, research published in 2025, documents how Old Norse loanwords entered English. Not high culture terms like French contributed, basic words, they, them, their Wörter pronouns, the most fundamental parts of language, law, take it a want, ugly. These are closed categories, difficult to adopt. The linguistic evidence suggests intensive contact, integration. But integration wasn't gentle exchange between equals, it was forced assimilation. Vikings settling in England brought thralls. Those thralls learned Norse to survive. Their children, born in Norse households, grew up speaking their master's language as their primary tongue. The genetic evidence supports this. Studies show Scandinavian Celtic mixing throughout Viking settlements. But the cultural transmission was one way. Norse culture absorbed Celtic genes through enslaved women. Celtic culture got nothing back but scars. The markets made it systematic. Dublin became Western Europe's largest slave market by the 11th century. Archaeological evidence is sparse because slaves were treated like livestock, sold in temporary structures, tended booths at seasonal markets. Permanent infrastructure wasn't needed. The Laxdæla saga describes a sale, 12 women in a tent. Melkorka, an Irish princess, captured young among them. She's sold to an Icelandic merchant. He learns later she can speak. She'd been silent for years, refusing to give her captors her language, her voice, her last piece of self. The saga treats this as a curious detail, but think about what it means. A child so traumatized by capture that she chose muteness over cooperation. For years. How many others did the same? How many found that silence was easier than speaking words that brought only pain? Hedeby in Denmark, Burka in Sweden. These were the other major nodes. Iron collars and shackles found at all 3 sites during archaeological excavations over the past century. Some argue these could be for animals, but their locations tell the truth. Urban centers, near harbors, trading hubs, not rural farms where animal restraints would make sense. These were for people. Anna Kjellström at Stockholm University examined skeletal remains from presumed thrall burials in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Published findings in multiple studies between 2013 and 2016 show consistent patterns: signs of physical abuse, healed fractures from beatings, nutritional deficiencies, poor diet, and something else. Dental modifications, horizontal grooves filed into teeth, previously thought to be warrior markers, but thrall remains show them too, forcing scholars to rethink: were these marks of slavery identification markers, like branding cattle? Or did thralls adopt warrior customs, trying to claim status they could never actually have? We don't know. The bones can't tell us what was forced and what was chosen. Children in this system faced specific horrors. Archaeological evidence from Sanda in Sweden, excavated in the 1990s, shows possible slave quarters, a large hall surrounded by smaller structures. Inside the small buildings, evidence of textile production. Sweden in the Viking Age relied heavily on textile manufacturing for ship sails. Each longship needed massive amounts of woven fabric, labor-intensive, skilled, profitable. Neil Price argues these small structures were workshops run by enslaved people, probably women, probably including children, learning to weave as soon as their hands were big enough to hold the thread, living in the shadow of the Great Hall, never entering it as anything but property. The site strangely looks quite similar to what you see in the United States in the antebellum period, Price noted in his National Geographic interview published May 4th, 2021. He wasn't exaggerating. The architecture of slavery has patterns: control, surveillance, minimized living space, maximized labor extraction. Sanda fits the model. Children raised in thrall families never knew freedom. They grew up watching their parents beaten for disobedience. Legal codes from medieval Norway, documented in various law compilations, refer to slaves using the neuter gender, not he or she. It, the grammatical equivalent of objects, animals. Norwegian law did state that slaves who killed invaders during an attack earned their freedom, but this was the exception. The law existed to protect Norse property, not to create opportunities for thralls. And for children born into thraldom, there were no invasions to fight, just daily labor, dawn to dusk, tilling fields their families would never own, building ships they'd never captain, producing textiles they'd never wear, feeding animals they'd never eat. The poem about Thrall and Thur's children isn't just names. It's a job description. Noisy, loud while working. Byre boy, living in the barn with livestock, stumpy. Growth, stunted by malnutrition. These weren't random insults. They were observed realities of slave life, encoded as divine origin story. But cultural assimilation was the true destruction. Physical slavery ended eventually. Cultural death was permanent. Consider the children taken to Iceland. Genetic studies show 40% of Iceland's founding population had Gaelic ancestry. But Old Norse became Iceland's language. Gaelic disappeared. No archaeological evidence of Celtic religious practices surviving in Iceland. No Celtic place names. The culture vanished. Its people remained as genes in someone else's bloodline, as labor in someone else's economy, as mothers of someone else's children. Their languages died on their tongues, their gods forgotten in a single generation. This is what assimilation meant. Not gentle blending, erasure. The Islamic slave trade, by comparison, had different mechanisms. Enslaved people in Muslim territories could convert, gain certain protections, sometimes rise to positions of power. Mamluk dynasties in Egypt and elsewhere were founded by former slaves. The Atlantic slave trade of later centuries had its own horrific logic, but the Viking system was unique. It combined the brutality of chattel slavery with the thoroughness of cultural genocide. Children were taken young enough to remake them. Old enough to remember what was taken, young enough to be trained, old enough to mourn. The perfect age for breaking and reshaping. The numbers tell the cold story. Ben Raffield's 2019 analysis in the journal Slavery and Abolition synthesizes decades of archaeological work. Thousands of iron shackles found across the Viking world, but thousands is an undercount. These are just the ones that survived 1,000 years in the ground. For every iron collar in a museum, how many rotted away? For every restraint found at a major trading hub, how many existed at smaller sites never excavated? The Spillings hoard on Gotland, Sweden, discovered in 1999, contained 14,000 Arabic silver dirhams, 66 kilograms of silver, deposited around 870. Dagvin Skray, Norwegian archaeologist, argues Gotlanders became intermediaries in the eastern slave trade routes. Furs and slaves went east, silver came west. The scale of that hoard suggests the scale of trade. That much silver didn't arrive from selling pelts alone. Human trafficking financed Viking expansion. The wealth to build the ships came from selling the people the ships carried. Dublin's slave trade peaked in the 11th century, then began its decline. The church opposed Christians, enslaving Christians. A monk in 870 saw Christian slaves for sale in Hedeby, sold all his possessions, bought their freedom himself. These acts of conscience happened, but they didn't stop the system. Economics stopped the system. Christianity eventually stopped the system. 1102, England outlawed most human trafficking. Dublin's market lost its biggest customer. By 1200, the trade had largely ended in Ireland. But not everywhere. Scandinavian legal codes mention slaves as late as 1241. Norway's Codex Holmiensis from that year contains rules about thrall ownership. The institution died slowly, reluctantly. Only as economic systems shifted from slave labor to feudal tenant farming. Only as Christianity's influence grew strong enough to make slavery morally indefensible among Christians. Notice that key phrase. Among Christians. Slavic peoples remained target populations even as Western European slavery declined, because they weren't Christian yet, because the distinction was religious, not racial. Anyone outside the faith was fair game. The children who survived slavery had two paths: die as thralls, or live long enough to see their grandchildren become free. Ruth Mazo-Karas's 1988 study, Slavery in Society in Medieval Scandinavia, published by Yale University Press, documents the social mobility mechanisms. Limited, rare, but existent. A thrall could save money from market transactions, which they were sometimes permitted to conduct if the value was less than 1/3 ounce of silver. Over years, maybe decades, they could purchase their freedom, or a master could grant it. Either path led to leysingi status, still not free, still obligated, still marked. Their children's children might escape the stain, might 3 generations, 60 to 90 years. Most thralls didn't live that long. Excavated skeletal remains show shorter lifespans than free populations. More disease, more violence, more infant mortality. The promise of eventual freedom was theoretical for most, actual for few. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Anna Kellström's Stockholm University skeletal analysis studies from 2013 to 2016 on Viking Age, burial remains with physical evidence of slave treatment, validated against William Fitzhugh's Smithsonian Institution Archaeological Interpretations, and cross-referenced with Peter Holm's 1988 groundbreaking paper, The Slave Trade of Dublin, 9th to 12th centuries, published in the journal Peritia, which established the documentary framework for understanding Hiberno-Norse human trafficking. This isn't speculation. This is what the evidence says when you dig deep enough. Now back to the information. The worst cases were the sacrifices. The graves tell stories the sagas only hint at. Flakstad in Norway, Kaupang in Norway, multiple sites across Scandinavia. Double and triple burials, where high-status individuals lie with decapitated companions. The heads removed before burial, sometimes missing entirely. Isotope analysis from multiple studies. Particularly Elise Naumann's work published in the Journal of Archaeological Science between 2013 and 2014 shows these headless individuals ate differently. Simpler diets, more fish, less meat, less dairy. They weren't family members. They weren't honored retainers, they were property, slaughtered when the owner died. The saga literature mentions this practice. Sigurd Arkvida Hinskama, part of the Poetic Edda, describes the Valkyrie Brynhilder's instructions for Sigurd's funeral. 5 bondwomen, 8 male thralls, all to be killed and burned with the hero. The poem treats this as normal, expected, proper. Archaeological evidence confirms it happened, not just in legend, in reality. At Oseberg in Norway, the famous ship burial from the 9th century included a wealthy woman, probably a queen or priestess, and another woman, lower status, possibly sacrificed. The evidence is debated, but it fits the pattern. Children appear in this archaeological record too, not as often as adults, but they're there, in graves, as offerings, as property. Medieval Icelandic sources, documented in Naumann's analysis, mention children being placed in foster care with people of lower social status, slaves, servants. This would affect their diet, their isotope signatures. Explaining why some children showed dietary changes between childhood and adulthood. They grew up in thrall households, fed thrall food, learning thrall skills, even if they were technically free, even if their birth families were Norse. Class boundaries in Viking society were fluid in some ways, but in others, rigid as iron. A freeborn child raised among thralls learned thrall life. The shame of that association lingered. The contamination of poverty and low status wasn't easily washed away. If this happened to freeborn children from poor families, imagine what happened to children born to thrall mothers. They never escaped. They never had a chance. Markets processed them like any commodity, graded by age, health, skills, appearance. Islamic sources describe Viking traders bringing slaves to eastern markets. Ibn Rusta, the Persian geographer, wrote about Vikings terrorizing Slavic populations along the Volga, taking captives, selling them south. The Bukhara slave trade, connecting Scandinavia to the Middle East, Arabic silver flowing north, human beings flowing south. Women and children especially valuable, adaptable, less likely to rebel, easier to train. The term sakaliba appears in Arabic sources, meaning Slavic slaves, but used broadly for any European captive. Some were trained as soldiers. Mamluks, others as servants, concubines, laborers. The Vikings fed a supply chain stretching from Dublin to Baghdad, from Hedabai to Constantinople. 1,000 years before globalization, the slave trade was global. The linguistic evidence of this trauma survives in unexpected ways. English contains roughly 1,000 Scandinavian loanwords from Old Norse, but these aren't evenly distributed. Many relate to everyday life. Art bread, egg, knife, sister, the window, dirt, skin. Basic vocabulary. This suggests not just Viking raids, but Viking settlement. Integration. But whose integration? The victors wrote the history. The survivors changed the language. English absorbed Norse words because Norse speakers lived in England, speaking Norse, having children who spoke Norse. But many of those Norse speakers were thralls, captured, transported, forced to adopt their masters, language first, then teaching it to their children. The English language carries scars of this process, words borrowed under duress, pronunciations shifted by tongues more comfortable with Celtic phonemes than Germanic ones. The history of English is partly the history of enslaved people trying to communicate with their captors, trying to protect their children by teaching them the conqueror's language, trying to survive. Children learned early that language determined status. Speaking Norse correctly could mean the difference between a beating and a meal, between being sold and being kept, between working indoors and working in the fields. This created desperate incentive to master the captor's tongue, to lose the accent that marked you as foreign, to forget the words that connected you to a lost home. Parents made impossible choices. Teach your children Gaelic, keep their heritage alive, and watch them suffer for their difference. Or teach them Norse, erase their past, and maybe buy them a slightly better treatment. Either way, something was lost. Either way, the system won. This was the genius of Viking slavery. It didn't need walls. The language was the wall. The culture was the chain. A child who spoke perfect Norse, who worshipped Norse gods, who knew no other life, that child was still a thrall, still property. But that child had lost the ability to imagine anything else, had lost the words to name what was taken. This was deeper than physical bondage. This was theft of identity. This was making the chains invisible by making them internal. Archaeological evidence from burial practices shows how thorough this assimilation became. Some thralls were buried according to Norse custom, positioned in graves according to Norse belief, accompanied by Norse-style grave goods, if any. They died as Norse, but they hadn't been born Norse. They'd been made Norse. Remade through violence, labor, deprivation, and fear. The sagas mention thralls occasionally, usually as background characters, sometimes as comic relief. Lazy, cowardly, ugly, stupid. The literary tradition reinforced the hierarchy, made it seem natural, made it seem like thralls were thralls because they deserved to be, not because they'd been captured, not because they'd been children when they were taken, not because the system needed them to be thralls so it could function. The Norse world economy depended on unfree labor, the great ships, the ocean voyages, the distant settlements, all built on the backs of people who would never be remembered, never be named, never be free. By the 13th century, when the sagas were written down, the Viking Age was over, slavery was declining. Christianity had transformed Scandinavia, but the saga authors still included thralls in their stories, still depicted them as innately servile, still used them as plot devices. When thralls appear as individuals rather than background, it's to betray their masters or cause problems, rarely as full characters with motivations and inner lives. This literary erasure completed what the physical slavery began. The people who built Viking civilization were written out of Viking civilization, their labor credited to their masters, their suffering forgotten, their children's forced assimilation presented as natural integration. the violence made invisible by being made normal. Modern archaeology is trying to recover these lost lives. Isotope analysis can show childhood diet, adult diet, geographic origin, lifetime movement. Ancient DNA can prove or disprove family relationships in graves. Physical anthropology can identify signs of violence, malnutrition, disease. These techniques weren't available when earlier generations of archaeologists excavated Viking sites. So thousands of burials were recorded without the data needed to identify thralls. The bones were documented, then reburied or stored. Now researchers go back through old collections, looking for the invisible people, looking for signs of slavery in remains that were cataloged as unknown individual or possible family burial. The work is difficult, expensive, limited by preservation and funding, but it's happening, site by site, bone by bone, story by story. The DNA studies add another dimension. Genetic evidence shows Viking movement patterns, but it also shows the movement of enslaved people, women especially, captured in raids, transported to Scandinavia or Viking colonies, having children there. Those children's DNA appears in modern populations. Iceland's genetic makeup, for instance, reflects this history. Modern Icelanders carry both Norse and Celtic ancestry. But the historical process that created that mixture wasn't peaceful. It was violent, coerced, built on slavery. The genetic legacy exists without the cultural legacy. Celtic genes survived in Icelandic bodies. Celtic language didn't survive in Icelandic culture. The women who were taken couldn't pass their traditions to their children. They could only pass their genes and their trauma. Slavery ended in Scandinavia gradually. King Magnus Eriksson of Sweden outlawed it in 1335, specifically for thralls born by Christian parents. This was a religious boundary, not a humanitarian one. Non-Christians could still be enslaved. The law carved out exceptions, but it marked the beginning of the end. By the 14th century, slavery in Scandinavia was being replaced by other forms of unfree labor. Serfdom, tenant farming, debt bondage. These weren't freedom. But they weren't chattel slavery either. The legal distinction mattered. A serf had some rights, a thrall had none. The shift happened because Christianity made same-faith slavery morally untenable, and because economic changes made slavery less profitable than other labor systems. Not because anyone suddenly decided slavery was wrong. The institution died for practical reasons, not moral ones. But here's the legacy that persists. The English word thrall means to be in someone's power, enthralled, held captive by an idea, an emotion, a person. The word survived in English long after the practice ended, because the practice left marks, deep ones. Not just in language, in land ownership patterns, in genetic distributions, in folk memory. The places Vikings raided have stories, warnings about northern men in ships, legends of kidnapping, folk tales where children are stolen away. These aren't pure fantasy. They're cultural memory of real trauma, transmitted across generations, distorted over time, but rooted in something that actually happened. Villages that lost their children to slave raids, don't forget. Even if they forget the details, even if they forget the names, the scar remains. Archaeological evidence keeps forcing revisions. The more we dig, the more slavery's centrality becomes clear. It wasn't peripheral to Viking culture. It was foundational. The wealth that financed expansion came partly from slave trading. The labor that built settlements came largely from thralls. The domestic economy functioned because enslaved people did the daily work: cooking, cleaning, textile production, childcare, agriculture, animal husbandry, construction. All the tasks that kept society running were done by unfree people. The Free Norse population could go raiding, trading, exploring because thralls handled everything else. This dependency explains the scale. 10% of the population enslaved, possibly more. That's not a marginal institution. That's a social structure, an economic system, a way of life that required constant replenishment through raids and trade. When raiding declined, the system couldn't sustain itself. When Christianity reduced the pool of acceptable captives, the economics changed. When other labor systems proved more efficient, slavery faded. But it took centuries. The children are the through line. Every aspect of Viking slavery circles back to children. Children captured in raids, children born to enslaved mothers, children raised in thrall households, children sold at markets, children sacrificed at funerals, children forced to forget their birth languages, children who grew up speaking Norse not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The system targeted children because children could be reshaped. Adults retained memories of freedom. Children could be convinced freedom never existed. Adults might rebel. Children could be trained into submission. Adults were temporary solutions. Children were long-term investments. Capture a child, get a lifetime of labor, and their children and their children's children, for 3 generations, until the bloodline diluted enough to erase the shame. This is what the movies miss. They show Viking raids as adventure, warriors seeking glory, brave explorers finding new lands. That's part of the truth, but it's not the whole truth. Behind every successful raid was a logistics train of human misery. Every settlement required workers who didn't choose to be there. Every voyage was financed partly by selling the people captured on previous voyages. The Vikings were explorers. Enslavers, warriors, and human traffickers, traders, and kidnappers. These aren't contradictions. They're the same story told from different perspectives. The perspective that gets repeated in popular culture is the raiders' perspective. The glory, the adventure, the freedom of the open sea, but from the thrall's perspective, that freedom was their prison. That adventure was their nightmare. That glory was built on their bones. The archaeological record from the site at Sanda in Sweden revealed one more detail. Published in the National Geographic article from May 4th, 2021, among the small structures surrounding the Great Hall, archaeologists found loom weights, spindle whorls, tools of textile production, and something else, children's toys, small carved figures, gaming pieces, evidence of play, evidence of childhood, but evidence of childhood spent in slavery. Spent in workshops, spent producing cloth for masters, spent learning that your entire existence was labor, that your value was measured in how much you could produce, that your future was more of the same, and your children's future. And their children's future, until someone 3 generations later might be free, might be able to own land, might be able to marry without permission, might be considered fully human under the law. This is the story that isn't in the movies. This is the reality behind the dragon ships and horned helmets, and it's worse than any dramatic scene could capture, because it was boring, daily, routine, normal. That's what makes it so terrible. The Viking Age lasted roughly 300 years, from 793 to about 1066, depending on how you count. 300 years of systematic child abduction, cultural destruction, forced assimilation, and most of it was just ordinary business. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. Just thousands of markets where children stood on blocks, thousands of households where children worked from dawn to dusk, thousands of graves where children were buried as property, thousands of families where children forgot their first languages, learned their masters' languages, worshipped their masters, gods, became their masters, tools. The violence wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was simply time, repetition, the grinding of years, the erosion of memory, the replacement of one identity with another, one generation forgetting what the last generation remembered, until nothing remained but genes and ghosts. In 2013, Elise Naumann stood over a collection of bones from Flagstad. 10 individuals, 3 missing their heads. The isotope analysis was complete. The DNA was complete. The conclusion was unavoidable. These were slaves, killed, buried with their owners. The graves were excavated in the early 20th century, the bones cataloged, then stored. Nobody knew for a century what they were looking at. Nobody had the tools to see what the bones were saying. Now we do. Now we can hear the silent voices. Now we can name what was done. The bones show abuse, healed fractures, poor nutrition, hard labor starting young, growth disruption, disease, and violent death, decapitation before burial, no ceremony for them, no individual graves, no grave goods, just bodies placed in the ground, marking their masters, status, demonstrating their masters, wealth. Oh, I was so rich I could afford to kill my property when I died. That was the message. That was the purpose. The thralls had no names recorded, no stories preserved, nothing but their bones. And now, 1,000 years later, their bones finally speak. Here's the archaeological site that changes everything. Woodkey in Dublin, excavated in the 1970s and 80s, before the Dublin Corporation built civic offices on top of it. The site revealed layers of Viking-age Dublin, streets, houses, workshops, and near the river, those small structures, 3 by 2.5 meters, animal pens, with hearths, with human fleas, with evidence of temporary human occupation. Archaeologists debate what these were. Animal pens used occasionally for people, or holding facilities for human cargo. The location answers the question. Near the harbor, near the trading center. In the economic heart of Viking Dublin, these weren't homes, they weren't permanent housing, they were storage, for merchandise that breathed, for inventory that needed food and water, for products that might escape if not secured. Children waited in those pens, between capture and sale, between old life and new, between identity and erasure. The structures were temporary. The trauma was permanent. The silver tells its own story. 14,000 Arabic dirhams in the Spillings hoard, but hoards like this appear across Scandinavia, Burka, Gotland, multiple sites, representing trade with the Islamic world. The Vikings sold furs, walrus ivory, amber, and slaves. In return, they received silver, silk, spices, luxury goods. The scale of silver accumulation suggests the scale of trade. Some estimates put the number at 67,000 dirhams found in Sweden alone. Each coin representing a transaction, many of those transactions involving human beings, children especially valuable in Eastern markets, trained young as soldiers, Mamluks, or as servants, concubines. The Vikings weren't the end buyers. They were middlemen, capturing in the west, transporting through Scandinavia, selling in the east, creating a supply chain that spanned from Ireland to Baghdad, from Scotland to Central Asia. Every link in that chain was a place where children lost their names, their languages, their families, their futures. The final evidence comes from the law codes. Multiple Scandinavian legal documents from the Viking Age and medieval period mention thralls, define their status, set punishments, establish compensation rates. Norwegian law from the medieval period valued a thrall's life in silver. If you killed someone's thrall, you paid compensation, not to the thrall's family, to the owner. For property damage, the amount varied based on the thrall's skills and age. Young, skilled thralls were worth more. Old, unskilled thralls worth less. The law treated humans as assets, calculated their value like livestock, set prices for their bodies like you'd price a cow. And this wasn't controversial. This wasn't seen as wrong. This was normal, legal, proper. The law assumed thrall ownership as a natural feature of society, protected that ownership, enforced it, made it official. What Vikings did to children was worse than movies show because what they did wasn't exceptional violence. It was systematic exploitation. It wasn't dramatic, it was boring. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was business. That's what makes it worse. The movies can show a raid, burning buildings, screaming captives. That's horrible. But it's comprehensible. One terrible day, one traumatic event. What the movies can't show is 300 years of ordinary days, ordinary markets, ordinary households where children were property, where speaking your birth language got you beaten, where learning your master's language was survival, where your children would be enslaved, and their children, where freedom was a distant possibility 3 generations away, where most thralls died before freedom came, where the system was so normal that the law protected it, that literature barely mentioned it, that grave goods included human sacrifices without comment, that children stood on auction blocks next to goats and nobody thought it strange. The isotope analysis from Flakstad revealed one more detail. The thralls' childhoods showed different diets from their adult years, meaning they were captured or traded, moved from one place to another, one culture to another. Their bodies recorded the journey. Their bones preserved the evidence. They ate fish as children, terrestrial meat as adults, or the reverse. The shift marks the moment of capture, the moment of sale, the moment everything changed. For high-status individuals in the same graves, no such shifts appear. Their diets stayed consistent. They lived in one place, one culture. They weren't moved against their will. They were the ones who did the moving, the ones who commanded, the ones who owned. The bones prove it. The chemistry doesn't lie. The dead can finally tell their stories, and the story is worse than we imagined, because we imagined dramatic violence. We imagined clear evil. We imagined something we could point to and say, "Oh, that was wrong." But what the bones show is something harder to face. Mundane evil, systematic dehumanization, ordinary exploitation, the kind that functions because everyone accepts it, the kind that doesn't need dramatic justification, the kind that just is. That's what happened to the children. They were systematically broken and remade, their languages replaced, their identities erased, their futures stolen, not in one violent moment, but in thousands of ordinary days. Wake before dawn, work until dark, eat less than your masters, sleep on the floor, watch your mother raped, watch your father beaten. Learn that your life has no value except what you produce. Learn that speaking your own language is punished. Learn that your children will inherit your chains. Learn that your only hope is erasure. Become so thoroughly Norse that maybe 3 generations from now, your descendants might be considered human. This was the system. This was normal. This was worse than movies could ever show, because movies need drama. This was just Tuesday. For 300 years, for thousands of children, in markets across the Viking world. This was the truth behind the legend. This was the cost of the longships. This was what the dragon prows really meant. Not adventure, not glory, not exploration, but children. Stolen, broken, remade, erased. That's the story. That's what the evidence says. That's what we need to face. In 2025, archaeologists continue excavating Viking sites, continue finding evidence of slavery, continue revising estimates upward. The more we look, the more we find, because it was everywhere, in every settlement, every household, every burial, the invisible foundation of Viking Age society, and the children were the future of that system. Not because Vikings were uniquely evil, but because children were the most efficient investment. Capture a child, get decades of labor. Train a child, get a worker who knows no other life. Break a child, get an adult who can't imagine freedom. The system understood what modern psychological research has confirmed. Childhood trauma reshapes the brain. Early life stress changes development. Identity forms in youth. Language acquisition has critical periods. The Vikings didn't have the scientific terminology, but they understood the principles. They knew children could be molded. They knew capture young enough meant total control. They knew forced assimilation worked if you started early. They built an economy on that knowledge, built a culture on those principles, and it worked. For 300 years, until it didn't. Until Christianity and economic change and cultural evolution made the system unsustainable. But while it lasted, it destroyed thousands of lives, erased dozens of languages, broke hundreds of communities, and left scars that persist in genetics, in folklore, in language, and collective memory. The Vikings were great explorers, great warriors, great traders, and great slavers. All these things are true. The movies show some of these truths, but not the hard ones, not the boring ones, not the ones that make the heroes into villains, not the children standing on blocks, not the languages dying on young tongues, not the cultural genocide by assimilation. That's the story archaeology tells. That's what the bones say. That's what happened to the children who were captured by Vikings. What happened was worse than violence. It was replacement. It was erasure. It was making someone forget they had ever been someone else.